More on the breaking news story that has seen DJ Tony Blackburn sacked by the BBC ahead of a report into sexual abuse following the Jimmy Savile scandal.
Well, the Radio 2 star says that he's been made a scapegoat and intends to take legal action after claiming there was a cover-up over an alleged assault on a 15-year-old girl in 1971. Mark Williams-Thomas can explain more. He joins us live from Broadcasting House in London, where he's just sat in on the first reading of the report. So, Mark, let's start with Tony Blackburn. I know this has gone legal, but the BBC haven't commented on this. But what can you tell us?
Yes, good morning. We have to be very careful because of the legal situation, but we found out overnight that Tony Blackburn has been sacked by the BBC. This is in relation to some evidence that he has given to the Dame Janet Smith inquiry that has resulted in his job now being taken away. We haven't yet had a full response from the BBC, and I expect that the press conference that has just started, they will probably go into those details.
And so just looking at, I mean, I know that we're treading on fairly dodgy waters here, but Dame Janet's review found that there was no attempt by the BBC to interview the victim or her mother. It decided that the broadcaster was quizzed twice by BBC executives, that's Tony Blackburn, and an independent barrister, yet Blackburn says that he was never interviewed over the incident. Was there anything in the report that clarified any of those issues?
Well, the report is great detail. It's 5 files full, and there's one page or one book that deals with the summaries, and there are information there in relation to the allegation that Tony Blackburn is facing. And that directly relates to a young girl, Claire McAlpine, who made an allegation that she was sexually assaulted at the BBC. That was reported to the BBC, and it wasn't properly investigated. The report goes into an awful lot more detail. That's just one element of it, but it particularly focuses on Savile's offending whilst at the BBC, and indeed also Stuart Hall's offending at the BBC. And some of the key aspects that come out of that is that it's very clearly from the author saying that the culture that existed within the BBC enabled both Savile and Stuart Hall to get away with their offending. Savile particularly created the opportunity to get access to young children. Indeed, many of his programmes were specifically focused on that. And it highlighted 5 particular cases where information was known to management within the BBC but not acted upon. And those ranged from inappropriate comments all the way up to indecent assault on one occasion. That was reported, and in fact there's a very worrying one of those reports where actually the child reported an assault having taken place at the Top of the Pops, reported it to a number of different people, and the child was then evicted from Top of the Pops. So this is a very worrying report. I think the BBC have had a week to look at it, will be very concerned about its findings and the implications that has both for the BBC and of course for the wider field. And I think to a degree it brings to an end 4 years since my programme in 2012, which exposed Jimmy Savile, and hopefully for some of those victims brings closure.
Well, this report has cost an awful lot of money. What happens next? What happens with these findings?
Well, the findings have been given to the BBC. They've now got 6 months they've been given 6 months in which to respond to some of those allegations. And those allegations particularly focused around whistleblowing, child protection and policies and procedures. And once they've responded to that, hopefully they've put into place some of the learning lessons from this report. But I think it is very clear that the concerns that have been highlighted in this report do make for very, very worrying reading.
The thing is, Mark, that listening to this and looking back historically over the 4 years since your programme, do we learn anything, or is it a case of saying, right, my goodness me, that was awful, that all happened back then, we must never be sure that it never happens again, or is it possible that it could still happen and still be hidden?
Well, that's the real worry, Philip, is that the author themselves, Dame Janet Smith, has said that there is no way that she can say that this isn't going on now and that there aren't other high-profile individuals. There was a position where talent, and being talent, the individuals who are the presenters on the show, have almost become untouchable because the BBC wasn't in a position to challenge those people. Those people were more important than the values of the BBC. And of course that's a real concern. But I think the biggest issue that comes out of this, and the biggest question, is who knew what, and did somebody, or was somebody in a position to do something about this? Now, in relation to Jimmy Savile, the author has found that there was no senior management that was in a position to know and therefore to do something about it. In relation to Hall, the author finds that actually in Manchester there was senior management that knew and they could have done something about it. So those concerns very much exist. The author also goes on and says, in fact, the controller of the Radio 1 and Radio 2 did have concerns raised to them, and as a result of that started the investigation. But they themselves didn't think that Jimmy Savile had anything to answer. So although allegations were made, they'd immediately dismissed them at the start. So for me, there's still questions about where that line is drawn about senior management, and this is where the author is very clear. The author says that senior management is from heads of department, not lower than that. So if you took away the line that she has drawn in relation to senior management, you would be saying the findings are that management at the BBC knew that Savile was offending.
Okay. But I've got to press the point, though, Mark. I do understand that, but, you know, a line is drawn, we understand, we'll learn from our mistakes, but we've opened the paper this morning and another prominent broadcaster's career appears to have gone up in flames, and there are contradicting reports, so nothing's clear.
No, and I think there is a problem there. Of course, the Tony Blackburn situation, I think, will unfold over the days and weeks ahead of us, and I think that there is an awful lot more to come from that. Of course, he is vehemently denying that he has done anything wrong, and in fact, he's very clearly saying the evidence that he gave is the correct evidence. And of course, Dame Janet Smith and the BBC have different views. So I think that will play itself out over the forthcoming weeks. We're sadly, many reviews later, we're now in a situation that whilst 4 years has passed since Savile's offending, there are some aspects that are no clearer now than they were before this review started.